All right, and good evening. I want to welcome everyone to Rebel News, to this discussion on U.S. in Revolt, Black Lives Matter. We're absolutely thrilled and honored to have three socialist activists from the United States here with us tonight. The whole world has been watching the explosive rebellion and revolt across the United States since the horrendous murder of George Floyd that went viral on May 25th. We've been watching, we've been supporting, we've been standing in solidarity. Many of us have been attending protests ourselves with the hundreds of thousands of people across the United States who've taken to the streets to demand justice. Here in Ireland, we've had a series of protests as well. In fact, I was here at a rally in Derry on Saturday that was organized by Black members of the community here, and it was criminalized, and the protesters were faced with heavy-handed intimidation, harassment, and fines by the police for breaking social distancing guidelines. Yet across the world, and especially across the United States, people are organizing and protesting and rebelling in spite of the coronavirus pandemic, which we all know disproportionately impacts Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And people have continued to protest across the United States, despite brutal police repression, mass arrests, and the deployment of the National Guard. And so I want to welcome our guests tonight. We have Khury Petersen here from New York City. She's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, Afro-Socialist and Socialists of Color Caucus. She's also a member of Legal Workers Rank and File. We have Khury Petersen-Smith, who's a Boston-based socialist, longtime organizer and campaigner for social and economic justice. He's written extensively on U.S. imperialism as well as Black liberation. And we have Todd St Hill from Chicago, who is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, Afro-Socialist and Socialists of Color Caucus as well. And he's the co-founder of the forthcoming Left Out magazine. So I want to begin by hearing from our guests. We'll start with Todd, just about what has been transpiring, what has the protest been like since the murder of George Floyd. So we'll start with you, Todd.
Sure. I'm going to take my video off just so that we have enough bandwidth, if that's okay. I was lag. Anyway, so what are the protests? I mean, the first protest that I went to was maybe 2 weeks ago on a Saturday. It was in Chicago's downtown city center, actually at on a bridge that was right next to the Trump Tower, in between the Trump Tower hotel and another hotel. And when I arrived, the protest leading up to that point was very peaceful, albeit powerful and angry. The protesters seemed all very young, very multiracial, but even in like the overall disorganization of the initial protests, at least the first weeks of protests, it was very clear that people were taking direction from Black folks who were coming, but that the people who were there, many of them were first-time protesters, possibly young folks who might have grown up in the time or sort of like been politicized by Black Lives Matter movements and the movements that have come emerged after it. So the political character of the protests were very, I would say, very sophisticated. People understood that that this is a systemic problem. The murder of George Floyd was a result of structural, systemic racism in this country, and that only a transformation of our society that includes the abolition of the police would free us from this kind of violence and this level of racism in our country and anti-Blackness. And that's something that many of us who were a part of the Black Lives Matter movement sort of realized as we joined protests. The police were very aggressive, violent towards the demonstrators. The following day on Sunday, police, including or protesters, including myself, and organizers in Chicago, well-known organizers in Chicago, were beaten by police at a peaceful protest. So, it was in the first weeks of the first week of the protest, things were very volatile. But I think as of the last few days, the protests have actually grown larger, and have still kept an anger, but it's sort of the same anger, but it's sort of a pensive anger. As we witness cities and states win things, I think people who have been out for the last 2 weeks are starting to wonder what we can win here in Chicago, and starting to make those demands and focus on making those demands.
Thanks, Todd. Haley, do you want to comment about what's been going on there?
Sure, absolutely. So Todd is right. These protests have been incredibly overwhelmingly young. A lot of my comrades who have been out to protest say that they've had to explain what a mic check is to people because they're so young they don't remember Occupy Wall Street and didn't have that experience. So that has been really quite incredible. I live in Jackson Heights, Queens, which is a predominantly Latinx neighborhood, immigrant neighborhood. I'm actually one of the only Black people that I would typically see walking around. And it's yet another example of how widespread the solidarities these protests have gotten has been. The kinds of signs that I've seen at protests here are things like Latinx for Black Lives, Asian cops uphold white supremacy. There's a certain level of consciousness about, first of all, the fact that cops are inherently part of the system of anti-Black racism, that there's not such a thing as a good cop, that even a cop of color is capable of imposing the same kinds of oppression on people of color. And I found that to be a big advance from the protests that I participated in even 6 years ago. The other thing that's been remarkable is the demand to defund the police has become pretty much the big demand across the country. In New York, that is, there's now a big call to get the cops out of schools because the New York Police Department has a heavy presence and contracts with the schools and security, so that students who might have minor infractions like cutting class or something will end up being beaten by a police officer or even arrested. So I was at a protest last Saturday, organized by a reform caucus of the teachers union called the Movement of Rank and File Educators. It's inspired by the massive teacher strikes that were led by CORE in Chicago. And there were about 2,000 people. The rally went all the way through downtown Manhattan. It was absolutely huge. And it met and converged with 2 other rallies that had been organized the same day from completely different locations, so that there were, by the end, maybe 20,000 people. And it was just incredible to be marching with that level of support. I've really never seen anything like it. Every bus driver we passed, and people may know the bus drivers in New York refuse to transport protesters to the jails, which are full of COVID right now. Every bus driver we passed had their fist up, was honking their horns. Every car we passed. I have just never experienced on a protest that level of solidarity from every corner. And that has been, at least one mark of how much of a sea shift this has really been. The last thing I'll say is, like what Todd described in Chicago, there's a big difference between the police presence here and in the heavily Black neighborhoods. In Brooklyn, near the Barclays Center, there's been a challenge that the police immediately kettled the protesters, immediately cracked down brutally. People have been arrested. There are actually about I believe I can't remember the numbers at this point, but there's so many arrests throughout the city, and many of these people are being held beyond 24 hours, which is actually unconstitutional, even though they're technically allowed to be released. So people are being held longer than they're supposed to be, and that's a big challenge for anyone who is facing, willing to risk their health as well as risk arrest. That's the overall situation that we're seeing in New York.
Thanks, Haley. And Khury, do you want to come in as well?
Sure. Yeah, I'll echo, what my comrades Todd and Haley have said about how widespread the protests are. And it's people, it includes people who have not only never attended a protest before, the people who've never attended a protest before are organizing protests too. So there are, of course, there are actions here in Boston that are called by groups that have been for a long time campaigning against police violence, racist police violence. But one of the biggest actions was called by a group of people. It was essentially a group of teenage friends called this action, and like 26,000 people came, overwhelmingly teenagers. And they took over downtown. The other thing that I've noticed is how widespread the protest is in terms of what parts of the city are affected. And it was cool to hear what Haley was saying about Jackson Heights, Queens. This is like Haley was saying, a neighborhood where there aren't many Black folks, and yet the protests are having an impact, right? Becca's from Boston. Boston, along with Chicago, are arguably the most segregated cities in the country. And I'm thinking in particular about a rally that took place in a neighborhood here called West Roxbury. Now, 6 years ago, when Black Lives Matter really kind of opened up, there were these amazing Black Lives Matter protests here in Boston. And in two parts of the city, there were actually pro-police rallies, Blue Lives Matter rallies. And one of those neighborhoods was West Roxbury. Well, last week they had a Black Lives Matter rally that hundreds of people came to. It's a sea change. There are neighborhoods where people have taken it upon themselves to organize their own local rallies. So it's not only the massive actions that have tens of thousands, it's the actions in neighborhoods that have hundreds. So it's so widespread. The other thing that I'll say is that we're winning. We're winning things. A comrade turned to me last week and was like, we might actually win some things out of this. And we can see it. She said that when we found out that the transit authority here, the MBTA, which the cops use to transport police, they said that they will no longer transport police or transport arrestees, which is incredible. The local public university, the University of Massachusetts at Boston, where the state police use the campus as a staging ground, they said they'll no longer allow the state police to do that kind of thing. In cities across the country, school districts are saying we'll no longer have police in schools. That's what happened in Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, also the university cut off ties with the police department. In Washington, D.C., where they put the military on the streets and declared curfew, as they did in other cities, that inspired more people to come out. And now we're seeing the military withdraw, not only in DC, but in cities all across the country. In Minneapolis, the city council is talking about disbanding the police, something I did not, we've been talking about and radicals and socialists have called for. But, when we were talking about that last week, I didn't know that this week that would be on the table in Minneapolis. So there's a wind in our sails too.
That's so incredible, really, to imagine, a Black Lives Matter rally in West Roxbury and in Boston, but also just to imagine how widespread it is. I saw some pictures of very white parts of Appalachia, seas of white people with Black Lives Matter protests as well, and I just think signs as well. I think it's kind of incredible. So a quick question is, why now? And I see Todd, you want to come in, so we'll throw that. You can come back in and say whatever you want as well. But why has this exploded after George Floyd was murdered. Why not? I mean, we all know that police murder unfortunately happens all the time. You know, George Floyd was not the first, won't be the last. There's been a series of outbursts after police murder, and then maybe they get quiet down a bit, or another outburst, or many people who've been murdered by the police we never hear of at all. So I'm just curious a little bit on your take about why they're so widespread and so explosive, but also what has sort of changed, or why now. So Todd, you wanted to say something else, so you can come on in, and then whoever else wants to take that up can take that up.
Yeah, I just wanted to add real quick onto what Haley and Khury were saying. I mean, yeah, we have the potential has never, in my opinion, has never been greater for us to win things. And to win the things that we have been demanding for the last 6 years. I also see, at least in Chicago, the impacts of segregation, and how conscious we, like, the left has to be, and activists have to be, and have been actually, over the last couple of weeks in combating anti-Blackness. You know, this week we had in Chicago, we had threats issued to Black Chicagoans not to go into Mexican and Latinx and into Mexican neighborhoods, or into Latinx neighborhoods in the city's southwest side, and that was telling about of the level of how these protests against police brutality extend beyond just police brutality, and it's really, in this moment, like, you know, there's an indictment of the police that must be had, but there's also an indictment of racism in this country, of that's also happening, and I think the response to some of those threats that were issued to Black people in Chicago, the response being our Latinx comrades doing unity marches nonstop up until I think yesterday they were doing them. And I think that, and it's had positive effects, but I think, like, things like that is something else, another aspect of this emerging movement, or re-emerging movement, that we'll still have to pay attention to. I think in terms of, and I think that is partly to your second question, what's different. I think that's partly what's different too. In between the Ferguson uprisings and the nationwide uprisings that we've experienced in the last 2 weeks, we've had a rise of the far right, backlashes against some of the things that the Black Lives Matter movement has proposed or has challenged about this country, and I think there's also been, you know, and with all that as a backdrop, you've also had the continued murder of Black people by police. The videos have never stopped coming out on social media, and we've had 3 years of this leading up until a COVID-19 pandemic that has forced people, in my opinion, has forced people inside to like, one, see these killings again and again, because we're on the internet, in our quarantine isolation, and also it's the case that, you know, the stay-at-home orders were enforced by the police by police, and that looked like an intensification of criminalization that Black people were experiencing before the virus, before the pandemic, and are experiencing through that. So, I mean, I think, to me, that's some of the things that I think that have led that have helped shape the explosion in protests and demonstrations so far. I think there's a lot more, but.
Thanks, Todd. Someone else Haley, do you want to come in?
Yeah, absolutely. I really agree with a lot of what Todd has said. I want to start with the pandemic because I think that has had a really profound impact on why these protests have happened when they have, and the way that they have so explosively. I mean, Todd's right. There's something profound about the fact that we have a global pandemic. We have a health crisis that is impacting absolutely every person on this planet. In the U.S., we have just a context where the government is absolutely unresponsive to this pandemic in any meaningful way, despite the fact that people are dying in huge numbers. And then in Black communities, they're dying in even higher numbers. I know in Cook County, Chicago, 70% of the people who are being affected by this virus are Black, which is also just a testament to how segregated this country is. The Bronx in New York is where the biggest impact of COVID has been. And there's something horrifying that when we should be focusing on our health and safety, like racism didn't just stop. Like, you know what I mean? It's like we're still seeing police murders, no matter what the situation is. When society's on pause, that's still happening. So you saw the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, who was literally lynched by racist vigilantes who followed him and killed him. You have Breonna Taylor, who was killed in her home. There's so many examples in the lead up to the killing of George Floyd that I think made it possible to generalize just how deeply racist the society is, how deeply racist the police are, in a way that was just undeniable. But I also think that, the Black Lives Matter movement didn't get to, I think, the level of organization that we would have liked to see around the country. There are certainly groups that have been organizing for this for decades, but the impact that the last 6 years has had on consciousness, since the killing of Michael Brown, since the killing of Eric Garner, the fact that you can literally draw a line between the words that George Floyd said when he died, "I can't breathe," and what Eric Garner said 6 years ago shows how little has changed in the last 6 years. And it also shows that protests really matter, because that has done more, I think, to shift people's ideas in the last, nearly a decade now, than almost anything else. And it reminds me of the last period of racial upsurge against racism like this in the 60s, where you had decades where people were doing, freedom rides in the 40s, where people were trying to take a legislative route to get things to change, to find which people were sympathetic to challenging Jim Crow. And for decades, nothing happens. And then all of a sudden, you have the 60s and people sit at a counter to defy racism, and it seems like the walls of segregation just come tumbling down. I mean, we're in a moment like that when you see decades where people have had demands like defund the police, to disarm the police, and suddenly these are mainstream, and they are, as Khury pointed out, actually meeting with victories in the course of 2 weeks. It is utterly incredible, but I think that there's a tendency on the left in particular to sort of downplay the role of protests, at least in the US right now. And I just think that this has totally undone any sense that we can afford to ignore that or afford not to participate, because this is where change is happening.
Thanks, Haley. Khury, why don't you come on in?
Yeah. I mean, completely agree with everything Haley and Todd said about, it's like, to look at what's happening now and answer the question of why it's happening now, you have to look at what's happened for the weeks and the years prior, right? And I've been thinking actually about, it was in 2012 when Trayvon Martin was murdered. This Black child was stalked by this man, George Zimmerman, and murdered in Florida. And in 2013, his murderer was acquitted of all charges. And I remember we had these fantastic protests in Boston. We tried to do some organizing, and it sort of petered out. And I remember talking to comrades who were so frustrated. We're like, man, you know, we tried to get something going, and nothing happened. You know, Trayvon is gone, and we have nothing to show for it. And then a year later, we have the Ferguson uprising, right? People hadn't forgotten about Trayvon, you know, when Eric Garner and Michael Brown were killed. And so then we had that wave of rebellion, you know, the Ferguson uprising, you know, Michael Brown and Eric Garner's killers were let off, as were Sandra Bland's and the Freddie Gray's and the many others. And so, as Haley said, you know, it's not just that George Floyd was murdered. He was murdered in basically precisely the way that Eric Garner was murdered, strangled to death in broad daylight by the police. And in so many ways, I think that experience that happened then, which after the protests stopped, after the protests disappeared from the streets, it's not the case that it disappeared from people's consciousness. They didn't forget. And I think they were primed for what's happening now. And there's a question of what have the people in power in this country and in our cities done to inspire any kind of confidence in the system, that it will provide any kind of justice, even in the midst of this pandemic? What have they done to inspire any confidence in the system that they'll protect any of us, especially Black folks and Indigenous folks and other people of color? So I completely agree that not only is all of that at play in terms of why now, but also why it's so militant, why it's so explosive, is because we've, you know, you've had 6 years since the Ferguson uprising, since the murder of Eric Garner. You've had 6 years to provide for some kind of justice, and it hasn't come. And instead, the past several months have been this pressure cooker in the U.S., I think particularly for Black America. And I just think about all the people who are on the streets now, who in our disproportionate numbers have been caring for the sick, infected with COVID, you know, who've been attending these funerals by Zoom because you can't attend a funeral in public, who've been showing up to work at an Amazon warehouse or at a fast food place or as a bus driver with little or no protection. You know, that's what these folks who are on the streets that were doing before that, who've been seeing far-right white nationalists have armed marches at state capitals saying that the economy should be reopened, who've been hearing about Ahmaud Arbery, who saw the video of Christian Cooper in Central Park being threatened by a white woman who said that she would call the police on him even though he didn't do anything. That's what we've been taking in. And I think that explains the protest now.
Yeah, I thank you. Thanks for those responses. I do think that looking from afar and seeing all these different groups of people, these really young protests, and then also seeing, you know, trade unions voting to, you know, the MBTA or whomever voting to not carry police in their buses, and seeing different things like that. I mean, there is a real question from the outside of like, so who are all these organizers, and like, are things coming together? I mean, I know there's people who have been doing this for decades, right? I also know that, like Haley was mentioning, there was a rally organized by Moore. I know that there's been rallies organized by different teachers unions in Chicago. I know that there's been rallies organized by different groupings. Is the Black Lives Matter official movement there? Is it really spontaneous and lots of different young people kind of leading, and is there a convergence of groups? Is that, you know, what role is the labor movement playing? So I know there's a lot of, we're trying to figure out sort of what is the nature, and maybe it's too early in a lot of ways. We're only 2 weeks in, but kind of organization? Is there a direction in terms of these different groups? And I know, obviously, Haley, you're in New York, Todd, you're in Chicago, Khury, you're in Boston. So things might look different in different places, and maybe in some places it's much more centralized, and other places quite decentralized. But for those of us from the outside, can you speak a little bit more about that? Whoever wants to go first. Anyone?
I could speak a little bit to that. I think, so in New York, it's interesting. There's sort of two dynamics, right? It's New York, in a way, is similar to what's happening in Minneapolis, because the first thing you have to understand is they had just elected a mayor who was, not a right winger who's like, really talking about law and order, not doing what, Trump is doing from his pulpit, but it was literally elected on the basis of being a reform candidate. And so there's both the people who rallied to have him elected on that basis. There's the existing organizations in that city that have been calling for massive reforms to the police because of what they've been doing for decades. And this guy just got utterly, torn apart in front of his own house by protesters saying, what are you going to do? Are you going to be for the dismantling of the police department? They actually asked the question, will you abolish the police department? He says, I'm not for the abolition of the police department. And everyone starts saying, go home, booing him. I mean, it's really that's how you treat politicians at a protest. That's a lesson right there. But in New York, we have de Blasio, who, also was initially thought to be a reform candidate, has, a multiracial family, is literally being elected to undo the stops and frisks of Black people and Latinx people, who are like 80 to 90% of the stops, and instead does nothing for years. You have him trying to speak at a rally, and everyone turns their back on him at this rally. So there's something to be said about the fact that these things are bipartisan. And the reason I start with that is because I think that there are some unions that are definitely moving. It's clear that the transit workers in both Minneapolis and New York, as you mentioned, are refusing to transport police or to transport those who are arrested. There are teachers unions all over the country calling for cops out of schools. And yet in places like New York, I know there's a big challenge that the unions are so in bed with the Democratic Party that it's actually the rank and file members who have had to push from below to get their organizations to move. So that massive rally I mentioned at the start was not organized by the United Federation of Teachers. They've been reticent to come out against de Blasio or to come out against police because of the fear that, well, some teachers have, spouses who are cops. That's at least the excuse they give. It's a rally that was organized by this Reform Caucus more, and by the teachers and their students and parents who are absolutely sick and know that that change is not going to come from above. So they're pushing from below, and I think that the more we see of that kind of action, the more we're going to see the unions being forced to move, because people are tired. People are not going to take this anymore. In terms of the connections with existing organizations, I'd like to hear, what Khury and Todd have to say. I have less of a sense of that. I do have a sense that I think it'd be wrong to say that these protests are totally spontaneous because of the other factors that we mentioned about why this has been something that's been building for years now. But in a sense, there is a real vacuum of organization. There are groups like Black Lives Matter that have put out calls, I've gotten texts, things like that, about coming out to protest, which has been really important. But in terms of who's organizing, it's kind of all over the place. I mean, almost anyone can call a protest and people are just coming out. So I I think there remains a question of how we can start to link up some of the existing organizations and create spaces for the newer people who are becoming leaders of this movement to actually have a stake and a say in what the next steps are. What kind of demands do we want? What kind of tactics are we going to be able to use if there's a second wave of COVID in the fall and we still need to figure out ways to be able to mobilize? So there are a lot of questions that are still unanswered in these first 2 weeks, but I think there's a lot of potential.
Thanks, Haley. Khury, do you want to come on in?
Yeah, I would love to, because I want to say some things. And I want to hear what Todd says too, because Todd has been involved in some very deep organizing in Chicago for a long time. I'm really curious as to, from where you sit, how it looks. But I really agree with what Haley said. Like, I think my sense is that this is a transitional time. On one hand, there have been, there are longstanding organizations that were created in the 1960s, or before, kind of civil rights organizations. So, that when Black Lives Matter started, some of those organizations were part of it, and there was also kind of famously some rifts. I mean, there were like civil rights activists who were active, in previous eras, who went to Ferguson and chastised, young people for being so militant and so on. And it pointed to some existing organizations kind of being ready for a new moment, and also the need perhaps for some new organization. And one thing is there has been, I think, some really incredible organization that has developed in between then and now. In particular, there's been this, I don't know how evident it is outside of the US. There's been a more and more public conversation about it in the US, something that started more out of the spotlight, but I think has entered in recent months. But this incredible movement to abolish cash bail, which is like, in the US, when you get arrested, you have to get bailed out of jail, and if you don't have the cash to get bailed out, you stay in jail. And very obviously, that means that poor people have to stay in jail, and overwhelmingly or disproportionately Black folks, and other people of color. And so there has been a movement not only involving local funds raising money to bail folks out, people who otherwise couldn't afford bail, but also calling for the abolition of cash bail as a system. There's been this incredible struggle, more powerful in some cities than others, demanding no new jails. So in New York City, there's this incredible campaign calling for the closure of the most notorious jail, Rikers Island, and saying that jail shouldn't be replaced with a new one, because the city officials finally said, okay, we can close Rikers, and we're going to build, I think it was, Haley can correct me if I'm wrong, I think they wanted to build multiple jails, four jails to replace the one that they closed. So the No New Jails campaign. So there have been these organizations and movements that have existed. There have been other movements and organizations that I'm thinking about the labor movement, which, putting aside labor on the question of Black Lives Matter, like labor for itself, I think, has been in a real crisis for a long time, has been facing attack after attack. And there's this question of which direction is the labor movement going to go, right? And so I think it's really interesting, like what Haley was saying about how there have been folks in the labor movement responding to this new upsurge, but not necessarily like across the board or institutionally. Like maybe it's, there's particular unions. My understanding is the transit workers in Minneapolis said, okay, yeah, we're not going to cooperate. And then it's like rank and file activists in other places, as Haley was saying, teachers in New York City. So I think you have like these long-standing organizations that are faced with a challenge that's like, what are you going to do? Where do you fit in this moment? And truthfully, where they fit in on the question of Black lives is where they fit in the world. I mean, if labor can't get the question of Black Lives Matter right, it can't save itself either. You know, there are these organizations that have come around on the racism of the criminal justice system in particular, and then also there are so many new people who are coming into the movement that I think we're going to see we are seeing the emergence of new organization too. The last thing I'll say just about this is, you know, in the time since the wave of protests in 2014, 2015, I think a lot of people, it's like people, yes, have been like watching these horrific videos of Black folks being brutalized and killed. But a lot of people have been reading too. Like there've also been these like book clubs springing up where people are reading abolitionist literature. Figures like Angela Davis continue to grow in popularity. A lot of people have been reading, like the folks who, I think that it speaks to the character, the militancy, and the kind of like political sophistication that Todd was talking about. Like, folks haven't just been like sitting back waiting for this moment. People have been preparing in many ways, and I think that's going to help with the kind of organization that emerges from this.
That's really interesting. I was reading Michelle Alexander's op-ed today in the New York Times, and she has a whole section where she lists the different books that people should be picking up. So clearly she's tapping into what's already going on right now in terms of people educating themselves and reading as well. So go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, no, where Khury left off was it made me think about some of the organizing meetings that I've been to since the uprisings kicked off. And, you know, in one of those meetings, I remember comrades that I've been organizing with for the past 6 years were saying like, this is it. This is what we've been organizing towards for the past 6 years. So like what Khury is suspecting is actually, I think is very true, particularly for people who have been, you know, some of these organizations, at least in Chicago, Black Lives Matter, Chicago, definitely. Let Us Breathe Collective, BYP 100, Assata's Daughters. These are organizations that have sprung up in the vacuum that the Urban League and NAACP left in the years of the Obama presidency, and have since continued to organize in very different ways than possibly the NAACP and the Urban League, and in some instances have given examples to these older organizations of how to where to focus and how to redirect their efforts in the years after the Obama presidency, right? So in terms of the protests today, I mean, people in Chicago, at least people, I think what fuels some of the anger in Chicago is that, you know, not less than a year ago, we made history in sending a cop to jail, but he only got 6 years, right? And then I think people are, on the one hand, and then, you know, right after that, we elected our first Black mayor in a long time, a Black woman mayor who ran on a progressive ticket and on a progressive agenda, but has since been more authoritative and has shown her authoritativeness in this moment by shutting down highways, by lifting the bridges that connect the city, the north and the south sides of the city, shutting down the city center, the loop, giving free rein to the police to run roughshod over protesters and beat and disappear protesters into the jails. Haley's talked about people, people being arrested by the thousands in New York, and being thrown in jails that are infected with the COVID virus. The same has been happening in Chicago, and and people have been held for over 24 hours, and many times protesters especially have been have had their rights to a lawyer been withheld. One of our comrades was in jail, was arrested on 2 Sundays ago, and the police refused. We got word that the police were holding up his paperwork in order to keep him in the jails because he was a prominent activist, in a prominent Chicago activist. It took the 3 of the 6 progressive socialist city council officials, and some prominent intellectuals in the city to make calls to make sure that this young man was released. This is the kind of mayor that we're dealing with, and I think although the protests have been largely unorganized, they have been. There is a growing need and relatively vocal, at least, for the organizers who know how to do things like break police lines, hold a protest line, find weak points in police lines, things of that nature, to be at protests, to hold trainings and things of that nature. And I think that's where the direction of many of the organizations, the Black Lives Matter organizations, are shifting towards. One, organizing actions, but also organizing trainings for people who are joining this struggle for the first time, who are clearly committed, have the energy for it, but just don't have the skills necessarily. And also developing. I mean, I don't know if folks might have seen. There was last week was a week of action that the Movement for Black Lives did, taking direction from the folks on the ground in Minneapolis, and in Chicago we participated in that by dropping sort of banners that push the message of defund the police, defending Black life, which are the 2 major hashtags that I think are being pushed online, and then making demands about like exactly what we mean when we say defund the police, and that including getting the police out of schools, but also ending the surveillance of Black communities. A major campaign, along with I think the End Money Bill, which was a campaign in Chicago too, is ending the surveillance of and the gang designation of Black people who are out on a sidewalk on any given day, by local law enforcement, and end that information sharing too. These are things that our mayor, at least our Mayor Lightfoot, which I think is just the Black version of de Blasio, if you ask me, has gone on record as saying that she is not going to she is not going to approve, and using Black people and her Blackness as a shield to say, or as a validation, credibility rather, to say that like Black people want police in our communities. We've been begging for police in our communities. We want to be surveilled by, and we want our children to be criminalized. And while that might be true for a very few but powerful conservative Black folks, in my opinion, liberal Black folks maybe, the majority of Black Chicago does not want that, and that's not what the question isn't. Do we want more police? The question is, how do we keep our communities safe? Police are not the answer to keeping our communities safe. Surveilling us is not the answer to keep our communities safe. Jailing us is not the answer to keeping our communities safe. And I think in the coming days, we'll see a reemergence and a strengthening of that point from organized forces on the ground.
Thanks, Todd. It's really sort of incredible of the different groupings that have come together, and the types of demands that people are making. So one thing is sort of drawing to my attention is that all 3 of you are in cities that are run by Democratic mayors, Democratic machines. All three of you in different ways, a little bit less so in Boston, but have reform mayors. Boston, a labor mayor, as with the ostensibly around reform. And then obviously I think Haley's, if folks haven't seen the video of when Mayor Jacob Frey showed up in Minneapolis to this protest, in which his, I think, official position is that he is for reform of the police, but not abolition. And they've asked him, are you for defunding? Are you for defunding? In fact, are you for abolition? And he says, no, I'm not for abolition. And then has the longest walk out of this massive protest where people are shouting, shame, shame, shame. It's incredible. And of course, this is a reform Democratic mayor. And so a quick question for you guys is around, we're in an election year. So we're in an election year where obviously things sort of all got thrown up in the air with the primaries, with Biden as obviously the presumptive Democratic nominee, and the reality in a bunch of different cities around like what our city council is going to look like. Are they going to take progressive stances or not? And so I'm curious about the political establishment right now. I mean, obviously, the New York Times editorials have been very, very progressive. When they had an op-ed that was basically arguing for the continued repression, there was a fight back of staff saying we were going to walk out, and they had to retract, giving, it was a senator, I forget what his name is. One of you can.
Tom Cotton.
Oh, jeez.
Arkansas.
Right. If you needed a name that reminds you of the systemic and structural racism of the United States, Tom Cotton is one for you. But if you could talk a little bit about the political establishment. I saw even Mattis and some Republicans coming down saying this isn't the way forward. I saw on Twitter that Republican Mitt Romney, previous Republican presidential candidate, was on a Black Lives Matter protest, which makes everyone spit their coffee out and laugh. But at the same time, like, what is actually going on? So I am curious mainly about the Democrats, though I do think obviously in the Republican Party there's divisions, and I mean, with Trump is just a complete disaster, and the growth of the far right, there's divisions within there as well. So if anyone wants to talk a little bit about the political establishment, that'd be great. Who wants to?
Maybe I'll be happy to start. Yeah, I mean, it's wild because you have Trump, who said that we should be shot, that was his response. And I'm amazed at, let me back it up. I think there's a real political crisis, honestly, for the people who run this country, and it's a crisis of both the Republicans and the Democrats. So Trump, it's kind of amazing actually what the U.S. establishment, the whole establishment, but particularly the Republican Party, has accepted from Trump. I mean, I don't even have to list the countless horrendous just violations of human decency and literally illegal things that he's done before and since coming to office. And all these things have been fine, basically, as long as they don't threaten the U.S. ruling class's ability to rule, in particular the stock market, which has been doing great, I guess. I don't know. I don't understand. I don't know how that works, but apparently the rich have been doing quite well. And so they've tolerated, Trump praising Nazis, all kinds of horrendous things. And one of the many things that he has done, it's not only that he said that, not only did he offer no compassion to the protest, but he said that we should be shot. He is, he's tried to use the U.S. military as a partisan instrument. And I think that's why even, not only the military establishment, but people like General Mattis, who's a right-wing war criminal, is like, whoa, this will not serve the interests of U.S. empire well. So they've got a problem. Trump, the people disapprove of the way he's responding to this, and they approve of the protest. There's overwhelming support for the protest, which is kind of incredible. But then, as you pointed out, I mean, the cities of this country are run by Democrats. And so they've got a problem too, because where did this violence, it took place in Minneapolis, which is known as a progressive, the people who run the city pat themselves on the back for how progressive they think it is, as do the people who run all the cities where we live. So I don't know exactly how this will play out in November. It's a long time from here to November. I mean, I remember months ago, people were saying, oh my goodness, it looks like Bernie Sanders is it doesn't look good for Bernie. How is November going to shape up? And I said, a lot in the US these days, every week brings something new. I did not expect, a nationwide uprising, but that has changed the equation. And I think what's great is that it has markedly expanded the political imagination in this country basically overnight. So that leaves me very hopeful. I don't know exactly how that'll play out, but I think that there's something really positive there.
Thanks, Khury. Go ahead, Haley.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to what Khury said, but I did want to say so much can change between now and November. And I think what Todd said earlier about being clear about what we mean by defund the police and having a movement to give that content is going to be really critical. I think that, I don't want to be pessimistic at all, because I think this moment has created enormous opportunity. But I think that, right now Biden is busy telling Black people that if they don't if they don't vote for him, they ain't Black, or just totally out of touch with where people are. And yet we've seen, demands like abolish ICE or Medicare for all, or any number of demands be stripped of their radical content by politicians. And I think it could be very easy for that to happen, to defund the police, unless we're very clear about what that means. It doesn't mean we're now going to have a different police department come in. It doesn't mean we just need reforms to the existing police departments. And I think that the point Khury made about the billionaires right now, and why they have been so, unwilling to actually criticize Trump despite all the things he's doing, is because they're doing fine. Talk about looters. The mainstream media is focused on looting of, during these riots, and they literally made $400 billion richer. It's absolutely, we have to be clear about who the real looters in this country are. So I think the demand to defund the police has to be coupled with a demand to actually tax the rich, which all these same politicians are completely unwilling to do. And at the same time as they're saying that the money isn't there to fund education, to fund adequate health care for all, to fund all of these essential things that are that much more important during the pandemic and were important before then, we see the bloated police budgets, and we also see the rich getting richer. So the money is there, and we have to be clear about that fact as we move forward.
Thanks, Haley. Go ahead, Todd.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Haley and Khury were saying. I think I would only add that, the leader of the Democratic Party is currently backtracking on his racist comments, his anti-Black comments, right? That's where the Democratic Party is. And it's a scary statement when you have the Republicans so seemingly effortlessly outmaneuvering the Democrats, particularly Joe Biden, on issues of racism and anti-Blackness in particular, courting the Black vote in ways that I don't even think they realize that they can't. But it's just just to watch the theater, the maneuvering of the two parties around each other and still tripping over themselves on this question of police brutality, it's shocking. And it's also, I think, I came to the realization that, when the COVID virus showed us that we are in this together, right? That was the slogan, we're in this together. And I think these protests will show us that all we have is each other in reshaping this country and the society to something that is not this, and that is, and for socialists, that is socialism. I just 6 hours ago, there was an announcement that the Democratic Party are going to announce sweeping measures to overhaul the police. And those sweeping measures, among few, are banning chokeholds and making it easier to sue cops. I mean, if the Democratic Party couldn't go up against the NRA, so I don't know how it can go up against the FOP. And then two, banning chokeholds is the thing that's the sweeping reform measure that's going to these policies will be the things that the Democrats and the political establishment will erect as a barrier to defunding the police, and certainly a barrier to abolishing the police. And I think if this is, and in so doing, I mean, they're continuing to dig their grave in terms of showing people how broken this country is, how absent democracy is from the political mainstream and from our lives. I don't know what that means for struggle from below. I hope, and a significant amount of part of me believes that will only excite people into being willing to take matters into our own hands and to struggle amongst working class folks. But I mean, we've named a lot of things that are hurdles that we have to overcome, whether it's in labor and whether it's in what we understand as the change that we want, and how broadly that understanding can be accepted by the massive amount of people who are in the streets right now. I think ending chokeholds is a no-brainer for those people who are in the streets right now. I think defunding the police is the thing that has won mass appeal to people, and that should be the thing that we hammer in, but it'll be a long fight.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. I think that question about victories and how to win victories is sort of the, and maybe we can sort of end on this question, then if you have any other things that you want to come in on, that'd be great. But just so a lot of demands have been brought up, and then I think the point that it's 2 weeks in of a US-wide rebellion in ways, and there have been concessions made or small victories or that really feel like the wind is in our sails, which is fantastic. The fact that not only are the police officers arrested and charged, not only with third degree, then second degree murder for Derek Chauvin, but then the bystander police officers, who we know aren't bystander police officers, they were actively part of the brutalization of George Floyd. So that's a victory, because so often police officers get put on administrative duty with full pay and aren't charged at all. Well, obviously a charge is not the same thing as a conviction. We know that too well in the movement against police brutality. We also know that saying we're gonna get the police out of our schools is not the same as them actually getting out of the schools, and saying we're going to lower the budget or defund the police in one way or another is not the same as fully doing it. So you guys have mentioned, the details matter. So I'm curious, obviously, so how do we begin to see those victories come to fruition? I think Todd spoke well about the need for a continued fight from below, and that hopefully there's a real sense of an opening of a horizon of what's possible right now. And the point that you made around the Democratic Party basically picking the lowest possible hanging fruit of, we disagree with brutal murder in daylight, of chokeholds, or, the fact that, in Ferguson, the demand for body cams, right, body cameras was like the big demand, that then it's like, well, the body cameras work, but it doesn't matter because they can still kill unarmed people. We see it with people's own video footage. What's the difference with a body camera or video footage that goes viral? Police are still with impunity killing Black people around the country. And so I'm curious about sort of, those are the pathetic demands of the establishment, and then quite amazing, inspiring demands of the movement, and sort of where do people see some of their power, where are the places where we can push? Are they on the local level, the city councils around defunding, the school boards? Like, what does that look like? And is that what people are talking about in terms of strategy and tactics? So that's sort of my last question about how do we make these demands a reality in a very fluid, volatile time where we obviously right now have hundreds of thousands of people coming out, a huge amount of support. I mean, 64% of the population support these protests, according to a recent poll. 75% understand that the murder of George Floyd was because of systemic institutional racism. 55% of people support the burning of a precinct building. The police station. That's insane. They feel like it was justified. That kind of popular support is unbelievable to try to get our heads around. So we want, obviously, you guys are all fighting every day, day in, day out, going to protests. Like, we stand with you. We support everything that you guys are doing. But how do you guys and the people you're talking to see some of these victories being real, rather than the rhetoric that then after 6 months, a year, or whatever, become sort of empty promises that didn't get realized? So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, but sort of, I think from afar, trying to see how people are talking about, really getting those victories and winning them. It would be good to hear.
Yeah,
Todd. And Todd, do you want to take your camera off, because you were breaking up a little bit before?
Sure. Is that better?
Yeah, better. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So, the question was, how do we see us winning victories, making victories?
Yeah.
I don't know. I kind of like vacillate between these approaches, but I think that at least in Chicago, there's going to be a lot of like very technical, almost technocratic minutia organizing, if that makes sense. Because, right, we just got out of an election, just finished an election. I think the FOP contract was just finalized. And that's the contract that holds police immunity, or police impunity, and allows them to, go weeks on end without taking a statement, and protects them from prosecution. I think these are the things that need to be reopened. If the mayor keeps going on like this, she will likely not be reelected. But in terms of the FOP contract, and in terms of some of these other campaigns and notions, right? Like the last teachers strike, the last CTU strike in Chicago, there were questions raised about the fight to get police out of schools, and whether or not that should be a real thing, a real campaign. And I think those questions, those unanswered questions, and these contracts need to be reopened, and organizations need to demand those things. We're not going to win without, at least in Chicago, without putting a significant amount of pressure on this mayor, pressure that perhaps she has never seen before. She is a longtime prosecutor. She has, but prior to that, she was an activist, so she says, and she's used to the kind of pressure that organizations and that protesters can put on an elected official, and you could see that in how she carries herself in office. I think that there needs, like, the kind of pressure that has been put on America by these protests needs to be put on some of these progressive mayors, the Chicago's included. And I think that, you know, and I think that's partly because, you know, of the makeup of our city council. I wonder if the same circumstances can happen that happened in Minneapolis can happen in Chicago. Our city council is not, on paper, is not as strong as our mayor, and I wonder, you know, given the recent comments of the Minneapolis mayor, is it the same thing? Do they have the same? Is there a local city government structured similarly? Because part of winning will inherently mean learning from struggles that are happening in other cities, in other states, and in other states. It's not, yeah, I think that it's a very hard question to talk about how we win, because, like Khury said, right now things are changing week by week, day by day, in this country.
Thanks, Todd. Haley, do you want to come on in?
Yeah, it is really hard to talk about victory when, like, this is such a volatile moment, and I mean, some things that I just kind of didn't know would be possible, maybe even like in the immediate future, much less like this week, are happening. Like around Minneapolis, talking about disbanding the police department. It's just kind of like, oh, you can do that? Maybe we should call for that elsewhere. I mean, the fucking NYPD, excuse my language, it's a mini army. Why do we need that many police other than to survey and brutalize Black people when everything else is being cut? There are $400 million in cuts to hospitals during a pandemic. It is absolutely criminal. So the funding that's going to the police is literally costing lives in two ways, you know, in both the literal sense of the police brutalizing us and the broader sense of what gets funding and what doesn't. I think there are a lot of challenges in terms of, you know, what actual police accountability would look like. And I appreciate what Todd was saying. You know, I think that it has to be more than just, we just need the courts to like actually hold police accountable. It's also, how do we take power away from the police that they already have institutionally? Can we actually put more pressure on the AFL-CIO to finally cut ties with the police union? I think that might actually be a winnable demand, or at least something that we could push in our unions. I am part of a group called Legal Workers Rank and File, which is a multi-cross-union, cross-organization organization in New York, and of legal workers. And basically, we've been trying to raise questions about how we can assist in this moment, because what has happened is, with all the arrests of protesters, they've actually been trying to set up additional arraignments so that they can just process these people as quickly as possible. And so we've raised the question, what if we refuse to staff it? what if our way of staying with the protesters was not to sort of piecemeal follow the rules and advocate for people one by one to get them out, but we just said, no, we're not going to, play by your rule book here. It'll be interesting to see what kind of creative solutions can be pushed through labor in conjunction with our own fights, because right now, I think the big fight for all of us is how do we stop a reopening before it's actually safe for us to go back to work? How can we link the fight between anti-racist struggles and calls to defund the police and calls that we're not going to go back until it's actually safe for us to do so, and we're not going to die for profit? So those are things that I'm thinking about. I think that the more we can link up these different struggles that are in fact linked, if we can draw those out, there will be more of a chance that we'll actually have the strength to be successful.
Thanks, Haley. Khury, why don't you come on in?
Yeah. I before responding to the question about kind of moving forward, just a couple of things to say. The first is I just want to I want to communicate how significant it is when you comrades in Ireland actually go and rally in solidarity with the struggle here, and all of the rallies, all the actions around the world. I really can't overstate how inspiring that is to those of us here. So not only in terms of the solidarity that you all show with us, but when you fight your own fights, because we know that the way to being in solidarity, it means fighting wherever you are, right? It means fighting with your oppressed people and fighting with oppressed people everywhere. So that's really, really important. And thank you, comrades. That it really means a lot. The other thing is that this is actually, it's like the terrain has shifted completely in the U.S. I think it's about to get way more complicated, actually. The far right white nationalists who I mentioned, who 3 or 4 weeks ago were having armed marches across the country, they haven't disappeared. They have been, we've seen evidence that sometimes as individuals, sometimes in more organized ways, they have showed up to the protests. A white nationalist shot and killed a protester in Omaha, Nebraska. So that's happening. It's also it's like the U.S. is it's like a monster that feeds off of Black people. It can't stop. Even as this uprising is happening, the police continue to, we find out the police keep killing us. So these things will fuel and complicate, I think, the conversation, along with the various other aspects of oppression in this country. There's supposed to be a Supreme Court ruling about DACA, the program for undocumented young people in this country. That ruling is supposed to come down soon. What Haley was just talking about in terms of pushing people back into the economy and so-called opening things up in the midst of a pandemic, where we've identified the things that it would take to return to life safely. We know that it would require more testing. We know it would require more comprehensive health care, and we know that those things don't yet exist. So all those things are going to be part of the mix. In terms of where we go from here, I think I'll echo what Todd and Haley said. It's like we got to raise the bar. Like the bar keeps rising. It's kind of incredible. And the bar has been set by some cities that now other cities can. We have an example. So in Minneapolis, they're talking about disbanding the police. Now we can all have that conversation in our cities. Even defunding the police. Which increasingly is being set as, the bar that people that kind of has a common sense to it. In Boston right now, the city council is discussing and debating whether to actually add more to the police budget. And so activists are trying to push to in the opposite direction. But we have a bar that's been set. It's really interesting in Washington, D.C., where again there's been really massive struggle. the mayor of that city, also a Black Democrat mayor, Black woman, Muriel Bowser, she had an enormous mural painted on the street of 16th Street downtown, right near the White House, that says Black Lives Matter. It's like this enormous painting that people should look at. It's really incredible. Many people took inspiration from that. Many people saw that as an empty symbolic gesture. And in fact, activists went, a couple of days after the mural was painted, activists went and painted, you know, where it said Black Lives Matter, they painted defund the police. Like, let's actually take this sentiment and make it real and concrete and a demand. And then Mayor Bowser, what do you say? You say that Black Lives Matter, but are you for defunding the police? So, you know, there are those kind of concrete and immediate measures. What Haley was talking about, the reckoning that needs to happen in the labor movement. Why are police unions part of these union federations? And that is a question at the international level, the AFL-CIO, and the local level and the state level. There are state union confederations where at every level we have to say that the police unions don't belong here. So there are many of these fights to have, getting the cops out of schools, which again has been done in certain cities, getting universities to disaffiliate from police departments, which again was done in Minneapolis. We should do that everywhere. And then I think on a bigger level, we need to raise the bar. We need to talk about reparations. One thing that's wild is, like, so David Brooks, who's a conservative columnist in the New York Times, he wrote an opinion piece a few days ago about reparations, and he was like, you know, there should be reparations, you know, but you know, I think we need to talk about how to do it. And I'm like, I can work with that. You know what I mean? Like, if the New York Times is talking about not whether it should be reparations, but how, then we need to, how much further can we as socialists and radicals go? So I think that's the challenge for us, is kind of consolidating and pushing for these concrete measures where we are, and at the same time raising some really big questions about reparations, about the Democratic Party. Frankly, that question has already been put on the table by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you know, one of the leaders of the progressive, really pretty left-wing elected officials. She said a few months ago, in another country, I wouldn't be in the same party as Joe Biden. You know, why? How is it that AOC and Joe Biden are in the same party? You know, that was a comment then. I think that increasingly it's like, well, let's ask that in a more serious way. What I'll conclude with, though, is I think that the lesson of militancy is one that I hope endures. When we talk about actually fighting for these things, you know, we have got, and I don't know what it's been like in Ireland in terms of the conversation, but we have just been bombarded with this notion that the protests are too violent. You know, all the media coverage of the protests, they seem to be primarily, if not only, concerned with, is this a peaceful protest or a violent protest? And the fact is, when we have fought the way we have fought, we won victories in days that we've been fighting for years. You know, these cops, how many cops have murdered us without getting charged? Well, these cops were charged in a matter of days because our protests were so militant. You know, the victories that we've talked about throughout this conversation, we've won because we're so militant. So we got to, like, think about this empirically. If you want to achieve change, what we've learned is that mass militant action is what wins. And I hope that we hold on to that as we move forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you guys so much for participating, for chatting with me today. I have been so inspired watching, and we have all been so inspired watching the protests continue to grow, the types of demands you're putting out there. And I know that it's a long road and a big struggle, and what we're up against is huge in terms of the really, I mean, to fight white supremacy and to fight the institutional racism, you're fighting the entire system. You're fighting the empire. And that's not just true where in the United States, but that's true globally. And so seeing the tens of thousands of people in Paris, you know, fighting, coming out in solidarity, but also fighting against the the insidious racism of the colonial regime. And same in Britain, seeing an ex-slaver in Bristol toppled and thrown into the water. A Confederate, or not a Confederate, a slaver, sorry, it's the U.S. head of mine, a slaver monument. And same here in Ireland. There's racist systemic processes or policies. There's direct provision, which is an unbelievably racist asylum seeker system, basically, that houses asylum seekers and doesn't allow for integration into society. There are racist individual acts, racist ways in which the Home Office, the immigration operates, and then there's the everyday racism that people face in society. And then there's the fact that the police came down extremely hard on Black people organizing for, themselves in solidarity movements here in Ireland, whereas that's not the case with the hypocrisy of they don't come down hard on the owners of meatpacking plants. They don't come down hard on other bosses that are forcing workers to work in unsafe conditions right now during a pandemic. They don't come down hard on the owners of care homes where people have been dying of the pandemic, where it's been of COVID-19 has been spreading through. They don't come down on people really hard who are coming and gathering on beaches. But when Black people organize a protest in solidarity with the rebellion in the United States across Ireland, and Black people themselves are standing up and saying, hold on a second, there's racism here too, and let's fight against the racism in this country, that you see the police repression. And so we are so thankful that you guys have been able to discuss this with us, but then also it's so amazing to see you guys, because I know this next week you'll all be back on the streets. You'll continue organizing in the groups that you're organizing in all the different ways. And so we stand in solidarity with you guys and really salute all the work that you have been doing to try to topple this corrupt and racist system. So thank you guys so much for speaking with us today. And does anyone want to say a final word? If you do, if not, we can just end it right there.
Just to reiterate what Khury said, this is so important. I mean, there's aerial shots from the New York Times showing all the protests all over the world. It is unbelievably moving, and it shows how important international solidarity is. And I so appreciate, the opportunity to speak to you, comrades, and to stand in solidarity with you. And look, a victory here is going to be a victory for people everywhere, and vice versa. So keep up the fight and solidarity. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you. All right. Good night, guys. And thank you so much. Take care.